I stood in the middle of the ballroom at the Four Seasons in Austin, the chandeliers glowing like captured stars above us, the polished marble floor shining with reflections of silk gowns and polished shoes, when my father raised his glass and shattered the fragile illusion of family that had been holding me together. "Rachel," he said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the string quartet's delicate notes. "You still owe me $2 million, and tonight in front of your brother and everyone gathered here, I want you to acknowledge that debt." For a moment, the music stumbled and then stopped. Forks froze mid-air. The chatter of 200 wedding guests turned into a suffocating silence. My breath caught in my chest as though his words had struck me physically. My hand tightened around the stem of my champagne glass until I thought it might shatter, and my cheeks burned under the collective gaze of relatives, colleagues, and strangers who suddenly saw me not as a bridesmaid but as a debtor branded in public shame. I glanced across the head table. My brother Daniel sat in his crisp tuxedo, a nervous smile plastered across his face, the bride clutching his hand as if she had rehearsed for this moment. My stepmother leaned forward, lips curling in satisfaction, and several of my father's business partners whispered into their phones, no doubt sending out texts about the scandal blooming right in the middle of what should have been Daniel's perfect day. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that I had never owed him such a sum, but my throat felt locked, my voice trapped somewhere between outrage and disbelief. I heard one guest murmur, "2 million at her age." Another hissed, "What kind of daughter does that to her father?" And just like that, my reputation was being diced up in whispers before I could even process the accusation. Inside my chest, my heart hammered not with guilt, but with a fury so deep it frightened me. I remembered every overnight shift I had worked to help Daniel pay for textbooks, every side job I had taken while Dad promised that someday it would all be recognized. Recognition, however, had arrived in the form of public humiliation. I felt the sting of betrayal wrap itself around me like barbed wire, cutting into memories of family dinners and birthdays where I thought we were still a unit, still safe. Now I realized those moments had been nothing more than fragile glass waiting to be smashed under my father's heel. The cruelty was deliberate. He had chosen this stage, the wedding reception, with its floral arches and overflowing champagne fountains, precisely because it offered the biggest audience. He wanted me cornered, stripped of dignity, with no room to argue. His timing was calculated to ensure maximum impact, the happiest day of Daniel's life twisted into the ugliest night of mine. I saw phones rising, screens glowing as guests recorded the confrontation. My humiliation would not only echo through the ballroom but ripple outward, immortalized on social media feeds before the cake had even been cut. I forced myself to lift my chin, though my hands trembled. I refused to let them see me crumble. My father's eyes glittered with something colder than disappointment. They glittered with triumph, the look of a man who believed he had finally caged me with words and spectacle. But deep inside, beneath the nausea and the rage, a thought began to take shape, fierce and unstoppable. This was not the end of me. If he wanted a war in front of witnesses, he had just declared it, and he had underestimated his daughter. Long before that night in Austin, long before the chandeliers and champagne, and the humiliation that would sear itself into my memory, my life had been built on sacrifice. No one cared to count. I was 20 when my mother died of breast cancer, and the house that once smelled of her cinnamon rolls became heavy with silence and expectation. My father, Richard, retreated into his work and bourbon, leaving the household to me. Daniel was only 18, then freshly admitted to the University of Texas, his dreams blazing with possibilities, and someone had to keep those dreams alive. I picked up double shifts as a waitress at a diner off I-35, working mornings from 6 to 2, then changing uniforms and pulling evenings at a bookstore cafe until midnight. My hands reeked of espresso and dish soap, my feet ached with blisters, but I convinced myself it was worth it. Daniel would graduate, Daniel would rise, and our family name would carry on. I never asked for thanks, but I assumed naively that gratitude would come naturally. When tuition bills arrived, I handed over checks cut from my tiny savings account. I remember sliding envelopes across the kitchen table while Dad nodded without looking up from his glass. When Daniel needed a car, I co-signed the loan. When he needed money for rent during an unpaid internship, I wired it without hesitation. I told myself I was investing in our family's future, that one day Daniel would remember who helped him climb. Meanwhile, I turned down grad school. I watched friends travel and buy homes while I scraped by in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and neighbors who fought through the walls at 2 in the morning. Every Christmas, Dad would raise a toast to Daniel's bright prospects. He would beam about scholarships Daniel had won, about internships at prestigious firms, all the while ignoring that behind each triumph there was a sister quietly shouldering debts and exhaustion. My stepmother, Linda, always chimed in with her sweet smile, "We're so proud of Daniel. He's destined for success." Then she would glance at me with that faint edge of pity, as if my worth was measured only by how much I could prop up the men in my family. When I scraped together enough savings to buy into a small tech startup at 23, I thought maybe my turn had come, but Dad urged me to sign over my shares to help stabilize family finances. I believed him. I signed, thinking family meant shared benefit. Years later, when the startup was acquired and shareholders walked away with checks in the high six figures, I received nothing but a hollow pat on the shoulder. That was the first time I felt the sting of betrayal, though I buried it deep under duty. Looking back now, I see how every decision, every compromise of mine was not just overlooked but erased. Sacrifice became invisible devotion turned into debt, and my own ambitions dissolved into shadows behind Daniel's spotlight. I told myself it was temporary, that recognition would come later, perhaps when Daniel graduated, perhaps when Dad sobered enough to realize who had kept the family afloat, but later never came. Later transformed into silence, into expectation, into a weapon that would one day be wielded against me in front of hundreds of witnesses. The warning signs had been there, scattered like broken glass across the years, but at the time I convinced myself they were accidents, misunderstandings, the natural chaos of family finances. The first came when I was 24, and the bank called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was refilling the pastry case at the cafe. The manager's voice was polite but firm. "Ms. Morgan, we're following up on your delinquent loan payment." I laughed at first, thinking it was a scam. But when he read out my social security number and the amount $150,000, I felt the blood drain from my face. I had never signed for such a loan. I barely made enough to cover my own rent. I rushed to my father's office that evening, waving the letter from the bank. Richard didn't even look surprised. He poured himself another drink, muttering, "Relax, Rachel, it's just paperwork. Families share everything. This is for Daniel's tuition and expenses. You'll get credit for it when he makes partner one day." I wanted to argue, to scream that he had stolen my name and my future, but his tone made it clear the conversation was over. He had always carried himself like a judge passing final sentence, and once he declared something, there was no appeal. More incidents followed. One afternoon, Daniel needed a new laptop after spilling coffee on his old one. Dad handed me his credit card and told me to pick it up. When the bill came, it was in my name. At family dinners, my stepmother Linda would joke Rachel's such a caretaker. She's practically Daniel's second parent. The table laughed, but inside, I felt a knot of dread. Their words weren't jokes, they were confessions of how they truly saw me, not as a daughter or sister, but as a resource to be tapped a well they assumed would never run dry. There were smaller clues, too. I once found a manila folder in Dad's study with my name scribbled across the top. Inside were copies of my pay stubs, bank statements, even my tax returns, all without my knowledge. When I confronted him, he snapped, "Don't snoop in things you don't understand. This is for your protection." The explanation rang hollow, but I tucked my suspicions away. At that point, I was too exhausted from juggling jobs to mount a full rebellion. Then came the day Daniel graduated law school. The ceremony was beautiful, the applause thunderous, and Dad's pride radiated like a spotlight. But afterward, in the crowded parking lot, Dad pulled me aside. His breath smelled of whiskey, even though it was barely noon. "Rachel," he said, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, "you'll always be the backbone of this family. That's why when the time comes, we expect you to step up again. Daniel's got loans, but you'll cover him until he's settled. It's only fair after everything we've given you." His words chilled me. Everything they'd given me, I thought of the endless nights, the empty bank accounts, the sacrifices that had already hollowed out my 20s. But in his eyes, none of that counted. Each of these moments should have been enough to spark rebellion, to make me cut ties and protect myself. Instead, I swallowed the unease and kept going, telling myself that family came first, that maybe, just maybe, they would change. I wanted so badly to believe that blood meant loyalty, but the truth was already carved into the pattern of my life. They saw me not as Rachel Morgan, a woman with dreams and rights, but as a ledger line, a guarantor, a safety net. I didn't know then that these warning signs were not just isolated betrayals. They were the blueprint for the ambush waiting at Daniel's wedding, the public spectacle that would expose just how far my father was willing to go to crush me under the weight of a lie. The ballroom was supposed to be a sanctuary of joy, a place where vows were exchanged and families united. Instead, it became the stage for my father's cruelty. After he raised his glass and announced that I owed him $2 million, the humiliation began to spread like fire through dry grass. At first, there was silence, that sharp intake of collective breath before the murmurs started. Then I heard the first laugh, short, bitter, incredulous. It came from Aunt Carol, who leaned across the table and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. I always knew Rachel was too expensive for her own good. My stepmother Linda seized the opportunity to drive the knife deeper. She dabbed at the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, her voice syrupy sweet. "Richard, I told you she wouldn't admit it unless she was cornered. Sometimes you have to shame a child to save her soul." Her words stung worse than the champagne fizz burning my throat. Guests at nearby tables leaned in, whispering, shaking their heads, their eyes darting toward me like I was some sort of criminal caught in the act. Daniel, my brother, sat frozen at the head table. His bride squeezed his arm, clearly mortified, but Daniel avoided my gaze. He didn't speak, didn't defend me, didn't contradict our father. The silence from him hurt more than the accusations. This was the same brother whose tuition I had covered, whose rent I had paid, whose future I had bled myself dry to secure. And in the one moment I needed him to stand by me, he chose cowardice. Then came the cruel chorus. Cousin Mark chuckled. $2 million! She'll never crawl out of that hole. One of Dad's business partners muttered. Richard always said she was reckless. The pianist at the far side of the room stopped playing altogether, his hands frozen above the keys as though the scandal had struck him silent too. Every corner of the reception echoed with judgment. I was no longer a bridesmaid in a navy gown. I was a spectacle, a warning, a pariah displayed under golden chandeliers. I tried to steady my breath, but the room spun. The camera crew hired to capture Daniel's big day swung their lenses toward me instead. Somewhere in the sea of faces, a guest lifted a phone, live streaming. The humiliation would not stay in that ballroom. It would leak into the world, onto feeds, into the eyes of colleagues and acquaintances who would never again look at me without suspicion. My reputation, my dignity, was dissolving in real time. Dad, sensing his dominance, pressed further. He set down his glass with a theatrical clink. "Rachel," he boomed, "don't stand there like a coward. Admit what you owe. Show this family that you have some shred of honor left." The words hit me like blows. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. He wanted witnesses. He wanted to bury me beneath shame so thick I couldn't breathe, let alone defend myself. In that moment, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made, every night of exhaustion, every dollar drained from my account. None of it mattered. To them, I was not a sister or daughter, but a liability, a stain to be ridiculed in front of chandeliers and champagne fountains. My knees threatened to give out, but I locked them in place. I would not fall, not here, not now. The humiliation was suffocating, but behind the burning in my chest, a spark caught fire. If my father wanted to make the wedding his battlefield, then I would bide my time. I would not give him my tears. I would give him something far worse, the truth sharpened and undeniable, waiting to strike back. The silence after my father's declaration was quickly filled with words that cut sharper than any blade. It was as if everyone had been waiting for permission to unleash their judgment, and now the floodgates were open. My father's face glowed with satisfaction as he leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment like a general watching his troops advance. "You've always been a disappointment, Rachel," he said, his voice booming across the ballroom. "Every dollar I invested in you was wasted. At least Daniel made something of himself." The words hit me with the force of a hammer. He wasn't just accusing me of owing money. He was rewriting my entire existence into a ledger of failure. My stepmother Linda nodded vigorously, her pearl necklace swaying against her throat. She's ungrateful, Richard. I warned you years ago she'd never pay you back. She only takes, she never gives. The irony of that accusation nearly made me choke. I wanted to scream about the tuition checks, the co-signed loans, the startup shares I'd surrendered, but the venom in her tone told me the truth didn't matter here. From another table, Aunt Carol piped up with her nasal voice. She's 30 and still unmarried. No stability, no children, no career worth talking about. Maybe if she'd spent less time pretending to be the savior of this family, she wouldn't be drowning in debt. Her words ignited laughter from a few cousins, the kind of cruel chuckles that ripple when people sense weakness and blood in the water. Daniel still sat silently, his eyes fixed on his plate, as though the shrimp cocktail in front of him was the most fascinating thing in the world. His cowardice screamed louder than any insult. It told me he valued peace at his wedding more than the truth, more than me. His new wife glanced nervously between us, her knuckles white against the stem of her glass, but she said nothing. One of Dad's colleagues leaned toward him, smirking. $2 million, huh? That's a hell of a debt. Guess you should have cut her off years ago. Dad laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. She was always supposed to pay it back. I raised her better than this. Then he turned his glare on me, eyes narrowing. You think you can just walk away from responsibility? Not in my family. Not in my house. The quotes rained down, each one a lash across my skin. My stepmother added the cruelest of all, her voice sugar-coated yet dripping with venom. Richard, maybe this is God's way of showing Rachel she doesn't belong among us anymore. Perhaps she needs to find her place somewhere else with people like her. The implication was clear. I wasn't family. I was a burden, a stranger, an intruder. I stood motionless, my pulse roaring in my ears, my throat tightening as if invisible hands pressed against it. They thought they were breaking me, and for a moment I felt myself sway under the weight of their scorn. But deep down beneath the humiliation, another feeling took root, something harder, sharper, anger. Their words no longer felt like truths to absorb, but lies to dismantle. They had reduced my sacrifices into debts, my devotion into failure, my very identity into a punchline. And in that crucible of cruelty, I realized something they had no idea what was coming. By the time dessert was served, my humiliation had already escaped the confines of the ballroom. Phones had been raised the moment my father's accusation thundered through the air, and I could see screens glowing across the room as guests whispered and typed with feverish fingers. The story spread like wildfire, carried out on Facebook posts, Instagram reels, and TikTok clips before the cake knife had even sliced into the buttercream. By the end of the night, I was no longer Rachel Morgan bridesmaid in navy satin. I was the daughter who owed her father $2 million. It started with murmurs among relatives at the back tables. Did you hear? Richard, $2 million. Can you imagine? Then came the comments uploaded by distant cousins eager for attention. One post read, "At Daniel's wedding, and his sister just got called out for scamming the family." Unreal. Within minutes, people I hadn't spoken to in years were tagging me, adding their own embellishments. On Instagram, a blurry video of me standing frozen champagne glass in hand already had hundreds of views, the caption cruel and mocking, "When Daddy's bill comes due." The fallout didn't end with family. By the following morning, colleagues from my firm were messaging me, their texts dripping with false concern. "Hey, Rachel, saw something online. Are you okay?" Translation: "We saw the video and now we're questioning your reputation." The partners known for valuing discretion above all else would surely hear of it. My professional credibility, painstakingly built over years of late nights and perfect reports, was crumbling under the weight of my father's staged humiliation. Neighbors joined in too. As I returned to my apartment on Sunday, Mrs. Green from 2B eyed me as if I were contagious. $2 million is a lot of money, Rachel," she said, clutching her grocery bags tighter. "I hope you make things right with your family." Gossip moved faster than any fact could travel. In their minds, I was guilty the moment my father spoke. Proof was irrelevant. A daughter's denial meant nothing compared to a father's booming declaration. What stunned me most was how gleefully they consumed it. People I had once babysat for friends I had grown up with, even acquaintances from yoga class. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion, a quip, a judgment. They replayed my humiliation like entertainment, dissecting my silence, my clenched jaw, my brother's refusal to defend me. To them, I wasn't a person. I was content. But beneath the public spectacle, something shifted in me. Every new rumor, every glance heavy with judgment, every message coded in faux sympathy hardened my resolve. If my father had intended to break me by dragging my name through the mud, he had miscalculated. Yes, the shame burned hot and deep. Yes, my reputation was bruised. But humiliation also stripped away the last traces of denial I had clung to. I could no longer pretend my sacrifices mattered, that my family valued me, that blood meant loyalty. Standing in my apartment that night, my phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications, I stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked older, sharper, carved by betrayal. And I whispered a promise that tasted like iron on my tongue. They had started this war in public, but I would end it the same way. Only this time I would come armed with truth, with evidence, and with the law. The Monday after the wedding, I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by boxes of paperwork. The faint hum of my refrigerator, the only sound cutting through the silence. My phone was still buzzing with notifications, but I had silenced it hours earlier. I no longer cared what strangers thought. I needed to know the truth. If my father could so casually announce that I owed him $2 million, then somewhere, somehow, there had to be documents, real or fabricated, that explained where that number came from. I started with my own files. Old bank statements, tax returns, and check stubs spilled across the carpet. My eyes blurred from reading, but as I flipped through year after year of numbers, a pattern began to emerge. There was no record of debt. What I did see, however, were withdrawals. Large, consistent sums pulled from my accounts at times when I had been barely scraping by. Transfers marked family expenses, checks made out to my father's name, sometimes endorsed in handwriting that didn't look like mine. Then came the student loan records. Daniel's tuition at the University of Texas had been steep, especially once law school began. I remembered wiring payments, telling myself each sacrifice was temporary. Now the hard numbers confronted me. Over the span of 8 years, I had poured more than $340,000 into Daniel's education, rent books, and living costs. My father hadn't paid it. Daniel hadn't either. It had been me every dollar. And yet at the wedding, my father framed me as the debtor, not the benefactor. Digging deeper, I pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years, documents from the small tech startup I'd once invested in. My original stake had been modest $25,000 cobbled together from years of saving. But when Dad convinced me to sign over my shares to help the family, I complied. I found the transfer form, my signature shaky from the memory of that day. Attached behind it was an acquisition notice from 2 years later. Shareholders had received payouts in the mid-six figures. I flipped through the pages until my hands trembled. The payout check listed to Richard Morgan trustee had cleared for $612,000. That was my stake, my future. Gone. And then I found the smoking gun. In a pile of bank correspondence lay a promissory note supposedly signed by me, committing to repay my father $1.5 million at 5% interest. My stomach clenched as I studied the ink. The signature looked like mine, but wasn't. The loops of the R were off the slant, unnatural. I remembered clearly I had never signed such a thing. The paper shook in my hands. Forgery! He hadn't just manipulated me. He had crossed into outright fraud. The pieces aligned in my mind like cruel puzzle fragments. The $2 million my father claimed was not debt at all, but a construction tuition I had already paid, startup shares he had stolen, and a forged promissory note to inflate the sum. He had orchestrated my humiliation with documents he knew were lies, counting on the weight of his authority and my silence to make them truth. I felt nausea churn in my gut, followed by rage so hot it steadied me. For years, I had accepted the erasure of my sacrifices. I had let myself believe family came first, that my suffering was a private burden I was meant to carry. But this was no misunderstanding, no invisible sacrifice. This was theft, deliberate and criminal. I spread the papers across the floor, photographing each one, labeling each file. For the first time, I felt the balance of power shift. My father had used numbers and signatures as weapons against me, but numbers could also reveal the truth, and signatures could betray the hand that forged them. I realized then that I wasn't alone. There were people trained to see these things to pull fraud from shadows, and I knew exactly who to call. I didn't sleep that night. The forged promissory note burned in my mind like a brand. By morning, I knew I couldn't face this war alone. The first call I made was to Monica Alvarez, a friend from college who had gone on to become a financial attorney in Dallas. We hadn't spoken in months, but when she answered, her voice carried the same mix of warmth and steel I remembered. "Rachel, what's wrong?" The moment I told her about the wedding, about the accusation, about the documents I had uncovered, she didn't hesitate. "Bring everything to my office. Don't shred, don't alter. Just bring it. We'll figure this out." The second person I turned to was my Uncle Frank, my mother's brother. At 65, he had retired from a long career as a CPA, but numbers still ran through his veins like lifeblood. I drove to his home that afternoon, a modest brick house lined with rose bushes my late aunt had planted. Frank listened quietly as I laid out the accusations, the forgery, the years of financial erasure. His eyes hardened behind his glasses. "Your father's always been reckless with money," he muttered. "But this is calculated. Let me take a look." Together, Frank and I spread the documents across his dining table. He pulled out a magnifying glass, tracing the ink strokes on the forged promissory note. "See this?" he said, pointing to the uneven slant in the letters. "That's not your handwriting. It's someone trying to mimic it." He flipped through my bank records, his finger landing on transfers labeled family expenses. "These are unauthorized. The banks will have copies of the original withdrawal slips. If your father signed, we'll know." The following day, I drove downtown to Monica's office with a box of files. She scanned each page with the precision of a surgeon, her pen tapping against the desk as she made notes. "This isn't just forgery," she said finally. "It's fraud, misrepresentation, and potentially identity theft. If he used your social security number to secure loans, that's federal territory." My stomach knotted as the weight of her words sank in. Federal. The very thought of dragging my father into court felt impossible, and yet the alternative was worse, letting him bury me under lies. Monica looked me square in the eye. "Rachel, you've been the victim of financial abuse. He's weaponized your sacrifices against you. If you want to fight this, I'll stand with you. But you need to be ready. This won't just be a legal battle. It'll be public, messy, brutal." I thought of the wedding, of the hundreds of eyes watching me drown in humiliation. I thought of my colleagues whispering behind closed doors. I straightened my shoulders. "It's already public. He made sure of that. Now it's my turn." Frank nodded from his seat in the corner, arms crossed. "You've got the evidence. You've got the truth. And now you've got people who believe you." That's more than Richard ever expected. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me, relief. Yes, but also strength. I wasn't alone anymore. I had allies, people who saw me not as a burden or a ledger line, but as a woman wronged who deserved justice. The documents that had once felt like chains now looked like weapons. And with Monica's guidance and Frank's meticulous eye, I knew I had the beginnings of an arsenal. My father had wanted an audience when he tried to destroy me at Daniel's wedding. He was going to get one. But this time, the script would not belong to him. By the end of that week, my apartment had transformed into something that looked less like a home and more like a war room. Papers were stacked in labeled folders, spreadsheets taped across the wall, sticky notes tracking dates and transactions like battle lines. Monica came by each evening after work, her blazer still on hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, carrying a leather briefcase filled with precedent cases and legal codes. Uncle Frank sat at my kitchen table with a calculator highlighting numbers with the precision of a surgeon. The three of us worked in quiet intensity, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. Monica guided me through every step. First, we'd document every withdrawal, every forged signature, every transfer. We build a timeline so clean the court can't ignore it. Second, we prepare for his retaliation. He will claim you're unstable emotional, that you fabricated this out of spite. Her eyes hardened. We beat that by staying calm, factual, unshakable. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Calm and unshakable were not how I felt. but if that was the armor I needed, I would learn to wear it. We filed the initial complaint quietly, not for the court of public opinion, but for the real court that could hold him accountable. Monica submitted the forged promissory note to handwriting experts who confirmed what I already knew: it wasn't mine. Frank helped reconcile every bank transfer with my pay stubs building proof that I had been the one funding Daniel's life all along. Piece by piece, the lies unraveled. Each document we verified was another nail in the coffin of my father's deception. But Monica had another strategy in mind. Rachel, your father used the wedding to humiliate you because he wanted witnesses. He believes control comes from spectacle. If you want to take that away from him, you need to be willing to meet him on the same stage, publicly. I stiffened. The memory of the chandeliers, the whispers, the shame still burned. You mean another confrontation? She nodded. Not planned by him, planned by us. You'll be ready this time. The thought terrified me, but deep inside I knew she was right. My father had turned my brother's wedding into a battlefield counting on my silence. What if silence wasn't what I gave him? What if in the very setting he thought was his victory, I delivered the truth instead? The idea lodged itself in my chest like a seed taking root. We rehearsed responses late into the night. Monica played the role of Richard, her voice sharp and cutting, firing accusations across the table. I practiced breathing, speaking slowly, not letting rage twist my words. You still owe me $2 million. Pause. Breathe. Here are the documents that prove otherwise. She pushed harder. You forged this paperwork. Response. That signature is not mine, and an expert has confirmed it. Again and again we rehearsed until the fear turned into rhythm, until the weight of his imagined voice no longer made me tremble. Frank handled the logistics. He prepared charts showing the flow of money from my accounts to Daniel's tuition, annotated copies of checks, even a comparison of my real signature against the forged one. Numbers don't lie, he said gruffly, tapping the calculator. He's relied on intimidation for years, but this time numbers will speak louder. As the wedding weekend approached, Monica made her final suggestion. Rachel, I'll be there. Not just as support, but as your attorney. He won't expect that. He'll think you're still cornered, still alone. But when I stand beside you, the entire room will know you're not defenseless anymore. The image lit a spark inside me, my father raising his glass to shame me, and then Monica stepping forward, briefcase in hand, turning his stage into his downfall. For the first time since that night under the chandeliers, I allowed myself a smile. He had chosen the battlefield, but I would decide the outcome. The ballroom glittered with the same chandeliers that had witnessed my humiliation, but this time I didn't feel like prey. I wore the same navy satin dress, my hair pinned neatly, but there was a new steel in my spine. Monica walked beside me, a slim black folder in her hands, her expression calm but fierce. Uncle Frank followed a few steps behind, carrying a leather-bound ledger that looked unassuming, yet contained the raw numbers of my life's sacrifices. My father didn't know it yet, but the battlefield he thought belonged to him had been rewritten. The reception swelled with laughter as Daniel and his bride circled the room greeting guests. I stayed near the center, glass in hand, waiting. My father couldn't resist. He raised his arm again, glass of scotch glinting in the golden light. Ladies and gentlemen, he boomed 2 nights ago, I made it clear my daughter Rachel owes me $2 million. Tonight, I'll remind her again because debts don't vanish just because you're embarrassed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests glanced at me with pity, others with disdain. But before he could continue, Monica stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, commanding attention. She stopped beside me, her presence radiating authority. Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice carrying across the room with crisp precision as Rachel's attorney. I must correct you. The only embarrassment here is yours. The room gasped, whispers ignited. My father blinked, thrown off balance. Attorney, he sneered. What kind of stunt is this? Monica opened her folder, pulling out a copy of the forged promissory note and holding it high. This document, the one you've been waving around as proof of Rachel's debt, has already been reviewed by handwriting experts. It is a forgery. The signature does not match hers in slope, pressure, or formation. In fact, evidence indicates you authored it. The silence was deafening. I felt eyes shift from me to my father. He sputtered, face reddening. That's a lie. She's lying for you. Uncle Frank stepped forward, laying his ledger on the nearest table. And these, he said, his gravelly voice steady, are Rachel's bank records from the last decade. Over $340,000 paid toward Daniel's tuition and living expenses. Every cent came from her accounts documented with checks and receipts. Rachel never owed this family a dime. Quite the opposite, this family has drained her dry. Gasps echoed across the room. Daniel's bride covered her mouth. Even Daniel himself paled, his eyes darting from the ledger to me. I saw the truth dawning on him. The comfortable life he had lived was built on my back. Monica wasn't finished. She pulled out another document, sliding it across the table toward my father. And here is the shareholder transfer Rachel signed under your coercion, giving you her stake in a tech startup. 2 years later, that stake sold for over $600,000. You cashed the payout, not her. That alone more than covers the debt you claim she owes. My father's hand trembled around his glass. The room wasn't whispering anymore. It was roaring with shock, disbelief, condemnation. Someone shouted, "Is this true, Richard?" Another muttered, "He forged her signature." "That's a felony." For the first time in my life, I watched my father falter. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his face blotched red and white. The power he had wielded for decades, the intimidation, the booming voice, the unquestioned authority crumbled under the weight of cold, undeniable evidence. I stepped forward, then my voice steady, though my heart pounded. You humiliated me in front of these people. You tried to brand me a debtor, a failure, but the truth is you stole from me. You stole my sacrifices, my future, and even my name. Tonight everyone knows who really owes who. The crowd erupted, some booing, some shaking their heads in disgust. Phones filmed every second. This time the cameras weren't capturing my silence. They were capturing my vindication. Monica closed her folder with a decisive snap. "Mr. Morgan, consider yourself notified. The lawsuit has been filed. The court date is set. This is no longer a family matter. It is a matter of law." The chandeliers gleamed above us as my father stood there frozen, his glass trembling in his hand. And for the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking under the weight of shame. He was. The fallout came faster than even Monica predicted. By the following morning, clips of the confrontation at the wedding were everywhere. On TikTok, a video of Monica declaring the promissory note a forgery had racked up 50,000 views in less than 12 hours. Facebook groups in Austin were ablaze with speculation. Did you see Richard Morgan get exposed by his own daughter? One commenter summed it up best. That's not a family dispute, that's a crime scene. The legal wheels turned quickly. The handwriting expert's report confirmed the forgery beyond doubt, and the financial timeline Frank built left no room for interpretation. Monica filed motions to freeze certain family accounts, arguing that my father had siphoned funds illegally. Within 2 weeks, the court granted an injunction. Richard's company, a mid-sized construction firm he had lorded over for decades, suddenly found its operating capital locked. Contracts were canceled, investors pulled out. For a man who prided himself on power and reputation, it was a brutal public unmasking. The humiliation didn't stop there. Local news picked up the story, framing it as a case of financial abuse within families. The headline read, "Daughter Fights Back, Austin Businessman Accused of Forgery and Fraud." My father's face, once featured in charity galas and golf club newsletters, now stared out from a screen beside the word fraud. He couldn't walk into a restaurant without whispers following him. Former friends distanced themselves. Business partners cut ties. Daniel didn't escape the consequences either. At his firm, whispers grew into formal meetings. Colleagues questioned how much he had known about the financial manipulation that had funded his education. His bride, who had looked horrified that night under the chandeliers, returned her wedding band within a month. Rumor had it she moved back to her parents' house in Houston, unwilling to tether her future to a family drowning in scandal. Daniel called me once, his voice hoarse. "Rachel, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." I listened in silence, the memory of his silence at the wedding louder than any excuse he could muster. When he finished, I simply said, "You had a choice that night, and you chose not to stand with me." I hung up before he could answer. As for Richard, the courtroom became his stage of reckoning. He sat across from me in a suit that suddenly looked too large. his hands fidgeting as Monica laid out the case. Each forged signature, each unauthorized withdrawal, each missing payout from the startup, all projected onto screens for the judge and the gallery to see. There was no booming voice to save him, no chandelier to lend him grandeur. Only evidence, only truth. The judgment was swift. He was ordered to repay me for the startup payout, compensate me for the fraudulent loans in my name, and cover Monica's legal fees. Worse for him, the district attorney announced a criminal investigation into the forgery. Prison was not off the table. I watched him slump in his chair as the verdict was read, his once unshakable presence diminished to a shadow. In the aftermath, the Morgan name, once respected in Austin, became synonymous with betrayal and scandal. Former allies whispered about the fall of Richard Morgan. Neighbors shook their heads, and the same social media users who once mocked me now flooded my inbox with messages of support. "Good for you," one wrote. "Takes guts to stand up to family, especially someone like him." Another said, "Thank you for showing the rest of us that it's never too late to fight back. I won't pretend the victory erased the scars. Betrayal that deep doesn't vanish with a gavel strike." But watching my father face consequences, real, tangible consequences, was the justice I had craved in the darkest moments. He had chosen to weaponize family in front of a crowd, and now the crowd had seen him stripped bare. When the gavel came down and the courtroom emptied, I stepped into the Texas sunlight feeling lighter than I had in years. The fight had taken months, drained me in ways I didn't think possible, but for the first time since my mother's death, I felt like I was standing on ground that was mine, not borrowed, not stolen, not negotiated away in the name of family. Mine. I moved out of the cramped apartment that had been both my refuge and my prison, and into a modest but bright condo in Dallas. I signed the papers with a steady hand, the ink drying under my name, my signature untainted, undisputed. I decorated the place slowly, filling it with colors I loved, photographs of friends who had stood by me, and shelves stacked with books I had once been too busy to read. Each piece of furniture, each framed picture felt like a declaration I belong here. I built this. No one can take it from me. Uncle Frank visited often, bringing roses from his garden, their scent filling my kitchen as we drank coffee and laughed about old times. Monica remained at my side, too, not just as an attorney, but as a friend. One evening, as we sat together reviewing a speaking invitation I had received, she said, "Rachel, what you went through, it's not just your story. There are thousands of people living in the shadow of financial abuse who think they have no voice. You can be that voice." So I accepted the invitation. The first time I stood on stage at a women's financial empowerment conference, my hands trembled, but when I looked out and saw the rows of faces, women in their 50s, 60s, some with gray hair pulled back tight, some clutching notebooks, I knew I wasn't alone. I told them about the sacrifices that went unseen, the loans taken in my name the night under chandeliers when my father tried to crush me in front of a crowd. I told them about the documents spread across my apartment floor, about Monica's steal, about Frank's relentless accounting. And finally, I told them about the verdict the moment justice spoke louder than blood. The applause that rose was not the polite clapping of strangers. It was fierce. It was knowing it was the sound of people who had carried their own invisible burdens and saw themselves in my story. Afterward, women lined up to speak with me. Some whispered, "My brother did the same." Others said my husband forged my name once. I never fought back. Their words stitched a new kind of family around me, a chosen family bound not by blood but by shared truth and resilience. As for my father, the last I heard, he was still entangled in legal battles, his company reduced to scraps, his reputation in ashes. Daniel, too, was rebuilding from the rubble of lost clients and a broken marriage. I did not rejoice in their suffering, but I refused to carry it as my burden anymore. Their downfall was not my shame. It was the consequence of their choices. On quiet evenings, I sit on my balcony watching the Dallas skyline shimmer, and I think about the girl I used to be, the one who worked double shifts, the one who signed away her future in the name of family, the one who kept hoping love would outweigh betrayal. That girl was strong, but she didn't know it yet. The woman I am now does. If I have learned anything, it's this: blood does not give anyone the right to chain you, to steal from you, to silence you. Family can be love, but it can also be a weapon. And when it becomes a weapon, you are allowed no, you are obligated to defend yourself. So I close my speeches with the same words I whispered to my reflection that night after the wedding, words I carry with me still. They may have started the war, but I will always decide how it ends.